Please, this is not an order. If you like the content, don't forget to like and subscribe our channel for more comments and discussions. Murder cases that take a long time to solve often attract people because everyone wants to know the identities of the people involved in these crimes. Unresolved cases are often due to a lack of evidence or a sloppy or improperly conducted investigation. Sometimes investigators deem items from a crime scene as not important when they may be key to solving the case. It sometimes happens that murderers remain at large for more than 15 years before being caught by the police, while others live their lives peacefully until their deaths without being punished for their crimes. When a criminal is caught by the authorities after several years of living in hiding, this greatly relieves the families of the victims because they believe that he will finally receive the sentence he deserves for his crime. In this video, we are going to talk about a case of several murders that took place in Gilgo Beach between 1995 and 2010 and whose culprit was found only some time ago. This case concerns a series of unsolved homicides that took place near Gilgo Beach, which is a beach located on Long Island in the state of New York. The murders were first uncovered towards the end of 2010, but some of the murders date back several years. On December 11, 2010, the first murder was discovered by chance by a dog who was taking a walk with his master in the area. The dog dug up the remains of a human being, who turned out to be an escort girl who had been missing for several months. The first victim was therefore identified as Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old young woman. An investigation was immediately opened to find out the circumstances of the murder and the identity of the culprits. However, during the investigation, the police found the remains of 3 other people in the same area. Thus, they understood that this case was about a serial killer. The second victim was identified as Melissa Barthelemy, also 24 years old. While thoroughly searching the area where Gilbert's remains were found, investigators discovered the remains of several other women in various locations: Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, Amber Costello, 27, and Megan Waterman, 22. These 4 women had one thing in common: they all worked as escort girls and had disappeared between 2007 and 2010. Their corpse was found wrapped in camouflage hessian. After this horrific discovery, the investigators and the authorities investigated thoroughly in order to find clues that would lead them to discover the identity of the killer, but without success. The victims were mostly women and tended to use online escort sites to get in touch with their clients. Investigators had worked hard to identify them, as some of the murders had been committed more than a decade ago. So, the identification of the victims was made difficult not only by the advanced decomposition of the bodies but also by the fact that some women were sex workers who did not have close ties with their families. Some victims were therefore identified through dental records and DNA samples, while others remained unidentified. A few months after the discovery of the first 4 corpses, the authorities off the island claimed to have discovered 6 new corpses, or rather, the remains of 6 bodies, some of which dated back to 1996. The victims were a little girl aged only 18 months and her mother, a woman whose remains had already been found in 1996, an Asian man who was probably transgender, a woman whose remains had been discovered in 1997, and a woman named Jessica Taylor, who was also an escort girl. After this macabre discovery, the police immediately suspected that the crimes were committed by a serial killer. Shannon Gilbert, who was the first victim found, had been seen some time before her disappearance calling for help and knocking on the door of a house, after which no one saw her again. This event took place during the night, and it may have been the day she was killed by the murderer. The worst thing about this murder case is that the killer often called the families of his victims and told them that he had killed their beloved daughter and described everything that had happened to her without any qualms. For example, sometime after the disappearance of Melissa Barthelemy, the murderer called her family with her cell phone and told them that it was useless for them to continue the search since they would never see her alive again. He made it clear to them that he had killed and tortured her before that. The local police stalled on this case for a long time because they did not have enough evidence to determine the murderer. Several suspects have been considered, but none has been named as the real culprit of these murders. In the Gilgo Beach area alone, a total of 18 bodies were found in a short period of time, but there was no indication that the murders were carried out by the same person. In other words, there was no evidence that showed there was a single murderer. Investigators were convinced that all the victims were killed by the same person or the same group of people, but there was no evidence that could confirm this. The police found the first clue to the murderer only in 2020, 10 years after the first corpse was discovered. Investigators found a belt near the crime scene that may have been used by the killer. The police have released a photo of this belt so that people who have already seen it can contact the police and give them any information they have. The belt had the initials WH or MH, which was a useful clue for investigators. All the years before the discovery of this first clue that led to the culprit, the investigators had not stopped looking for all the clues they could find in this case. They reviewed extensive evidence such as DNA samples, phone records, cell phone data, and online advertisements for escort girl services. As with the majority of investigations into the murders, they also interviewed witnesses and anyone who appeared to be related to the victims. To aid in the search for suspects in these murders, investigators have been looking for potential connections between this case and other cases of missing women and unsolved homicides in the area. Unfortunately, this further complicated the investigation as there were too many elements to assess and there seemed to be no connection between this murder case and the other cases in the area. It turns out that the investigation encountered several difficulties because some witnesses refused to fully cooperate with the investigation and the search area was wooded and isolated, which complicated the excavation. The Gilgo Beach murders received significant media coverage and were widely watched by the public. So, due to the intense media coverage and the pressure to solve the case, the investigators had a lot of difficulty carrying out the investigation as they wanted, and this slowed down the search. Over the years, several new leads and pieces of information have emerged, leading investigators to pursue different avenues to identify the killer or killers. The police thoroughly searched each crime scene and collected any element that could constitute evidence. They first collected the human remains, then they gathered the victims' personal effects, their clothing, footprints, fibers, DNA, and anything else that could help identify the killer. All the evidence collected was sent for analysis at crime labs to look for DNA matches, fingerprints, and other clues to identify the killer or link the cases together. It turns out that the investigation involved collaboration between various law enforcement agencies, including the Long Island Police, the FBI, and other law enforcement agencies, to maximize available resources and expertise. Let's go back to the evidence found in 2020, which was a belt likely belonging to the killer. After this discovery, the police followed a lead that led them to the main suspect. In March 2022, authorities began finding clues that appeared to lead to Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old New York architect. Among the evidence that was found against him was the fact that he owned a Chevrolet Avalanche similar to the one that the suspect who kidnapped Amber Costello, one of the murderer's victims, had. Moreover, the suspect's phone calls to the victim's family were traced, and the locations they came from were all linked to the suspect. In other words, the suspect frequented these places often or had been seen in these places on the days when the calls were made. The other evidence against him raised suspicions that he was clearly the culprit in several murders. Records of all the cell phones used by Mr. Herman provided evidence that the contacted escort girls and created fake names for an email account he used to research sex workers and sadistic pornography. Moreover, the data collected on these other devices showed that he took a great interest in the case of the Gilgo Beach murders and that he was following every step of the investigation. Murderers tend to check the news regularly to see if any evidence against them has been found, how the investigation is progressing, and the authorities' response to their crimes. During the investigation of the first 4 bodies found, the police found a hair on the canvas bag where Megan Waterman's body was. The hair was that of a man, but at the time, the police had not found a match with the DNA of the suspects they had collected. After having suspicions about Rex Heuermann, the authorities followed him for several weeks to analyze his actions and try to take a DNA sample belonging to him. Several weeks after the start of the investigation into him, the investigators were able to find a DNA sample of his in a box of pizza that he had thrown in the trash. This DNA sample was sent to the lab for analysis, and it turned out to match the one found at the crime scene. Investigators had found women's hair at 3 locations near the crime scenes, but it did not belong to the victims. This hair was compared with that of Mr. Heuermann's wife, and it turns out that it was hers. The investigators therefore carried out research on her, but they discovered that she was not linked to the murders. Whenever there were murders, she was out of state with her children, so there is no way she could have helped her husband commit his crimes. The only hypothesis to justify the presence of her hair on the places near the crime scenes is that her hair was on the clothes of Rex Heuermann when he abandoned the bodies of his victims. It turns out that the main suspect's home was near the place where the first human remains were found in 2010. Authorities were concerned that the suspect sensed suspicion against him and decided to flee, so they quickly took action. Moreover, they were afraid that he would commit other crimes because he often dated escort girls. Many people, including investigators, treated Rex Heuermann as a demon who had committed atrocious acts without thinking of the families of the victims or the victims themselves. When he was with his victims, he already knew their fate, so he planned his murders in advance. Thanks to the evidence found against him, Mr. Heuermann was accused of the murder of 3 women, including Melissa Barthelemy, Amber Costello, and Megan Waterman. That he pleaded not guilty to those murders but was taken into custody. He appears to be the prime suspect in other murders, so police are continuing to investigate him. Investigators say it is possible that in the weeks following his arrest, they will find evidence of other crimes he has committed so that he can be tried for all his crimes. Mr. Heuermann's wife and children have said they will cooperate fully with the police to find out the truth about Rex and decide how they will continue to live their lives. Prior to Mr. Heuermann's arrest, the police had investigated a warehouse in the Long Island community of Amityville. To the surprise of the investigators, they found over 200 weapons hidden there. There were pistols, revolvers, and semi-automatic rifles. All belonged to the main suspect, but not all were registered with the state. Only 90 were registered. After that, authorities raided the Omega self-storage facility as part of the investigation. It was this search that led to the arrest of architect Rex Heuermann. This suspect was charged with the murders of 3 women, whose remains were found along a beach road. That he was arrested so he wouldn't run away while the police looked for his connection to the other murders. Investigators said it was unlikely he acted alone to commit the crimes, but that should not be ruled out. The authorities have clearly stated that the investigation is far from over because now that the main suspect has been found, it is as if the investigation has just begun. The investigation has been able to develop greatly thanks to the efforts of Rodney Harrison, the police commissioner for the region, who was elected in 2022. Before joining this position, Hugh was chief of detectives and chief of the New York Police Department, and he devoted all his energy to solving the case of the Gilgo Beach murders. He succeeds in creating the Gilgo Beach Homicide Investigation Task Force, which brings together all the best full-time investigators with the approval of the FBI and local authorities. Only a month and a half after the creation of this team, the clues concerning Mr. Heuermann were found, and the investigation began to move forward. Authorities had warned people that anyone providing information that would aid in the investigation, or more specifically, that would lead to the identification and arrest of the suspect, would receive $50,000. At first, the sum promised as a reward was only $25,000, but the authorities increased it in order to motivate people to give all the information that would be useful to solve the case. During the investigation, a source said it was possible the killer lured his victims to his Long Island residence only when his family was out of state. In other words, he waited until his family was away from their home so he could commit his crimes undisturbed. The murderer chose a place he knew well to carry out his murders. He knew the environment around him perfectly and had all the tools necessary to carry out his murders and dispose of the bodies. The search of the home of the alleged culprit, Mr. Heuermann, took a long time because the investigators were trying to find a link between the victims. After his detention, Rex Heuermann showed no emotion and merely asserted that he was not guilty. Police say they are confident they will soon be able to charge Mr. Heuermann with the murder of fourth victim Maureen Brainerd Barnes, as a lot of evidence in the investigation points to him as the culprit. In order to find as much evidence as possible against him, investigators will trace his life back to 2010. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more reviews and discussions. Thank you for watching.